This week, we're going to consider the second big debate in the modern tradition of philosophy. Previously, we looked at the debate between rationalists and nativists on the one side and empiricists on the other side. This week, we'll be looking at the debate between realists, or materialists, on the one side, and idealists, or immaterialists, on the other side. Realism is the thesis that objects exist and bear at least some of their properties independently of our minds. So Locke is a realist, for example, because Locke holds that bodies exist independently of us and that bodies bear primary qualities independently of us, even though, of course, their secondary qualities are qualities that depend on our minds. An idealist, by contrast, holds that objects depend for their existence and for their properties on our minds. Now, a weaker version of idealism might hold that objects depend for very general properties of theirs on the general constitution of our minds. Berkeley holds the strongest version of idealism. Berkeley's claim is that objects depend for their existence and for all of their particular properties on particular mental states. Berkeley's thesis is esse est percipi, or to be is to be perceived. For Berkeley, all there is to the being of a thing is its being perceived, and all there is to being blue, for example, is being perceived as blue, or all there is to being triangular is being perceived as triangular. Berkeley's argument for this idealist or immaterialist thesis is premise 1, empiricism. All our ideas derive from sense perception. Premise 2 is the result of dialogue 1, that all the ideas that derive from sense perception depend on the constitution of our senses. Now, if all our ideas derive from sense perception, and all the ideas that derive from sense perception depend on the senses, then it would follow that all our ideas depend on the senses. So none of our ideas are ideas of the way things mind independently are. Given this result, if we're going to remain committed to empiricism, Berkeley thinks we have a choice. We could either hold that reality is mind independent and become skeptics, holding that none of our ideas are ideas of reality. Or, Berkeley thinks, we could be committed to anti-skepticism, the view that we can have ideas of reality. We can have ideas of the real quality of things. But Berkeley thinks, if we're going to be committed to empiricism and anti-skepticism, given the result of Dialogue 1, we must be committed to immaterialism. That is, we must hold that the real qualities of things are dependent on the senses. If reality is dependent on the senses, and all our ideas are dependent on the senses, then it's possible for our ideas to be ideas of real things. It's possible for our ideas to be ideas of the real quality of things. So if we become immaterialists, then we can be anti-skeptics while holding on to empiricism. Now, Berkeley's thesis of immaterialism does not state that there's no such thing as tables and chairs, or trees and forests. Berkeley's claim isn't that there is no external world. Instead, Berkeley's claim is that the external world is made up of ideas. So this table is real, but what the table is an idea. This chair is real, but again, what the chair is not some mind-independent matter, but an idea. Now, an obvious question that arises for Berkeley is, if tables and chairs and trees and forests are just ideas, are they ideas in my mind? That seems absurd. After all, the tables and chairs in my room don't go away when I stop perceiving them. Trees and forests don't cease to exist if I cease to look at them. And moreover, it would seem that ideas come to me passively in sense perception. I can choose what to do, but I can't choose what to perceive. And if there was nothing more to tables and chairs and trees than just my own ideas, it would seem that just as I can actively choose what to think about, I should be able to actively choose what exists. But of course I can't. The way Berkeley addresses this set of problems is to say that real things are ideas, but they're not simply ideas in my mind. Instead, there's a mind other than mine that perceives everything that's in existence, and whose perception of those things is active, in that this perceiver's perception of the things creates the things, and moreover, affects my mind with perceptions of these things. This omniscient, eternal, creative, and active mind, for Berkeley, is God's mind. So in this way, Berkeley thinks that a proof for God's existence is premise 1, immaterialism. Reality is dependent on the senses. But premise 2, reality does not depend on my sensing it, since real things do not go out of existence when I stop sensing them, and since my sensations are passive effects of reality, rather than being the active cause of reality. The conclusion that Berkeley thinks follows from these premises is that there must be a mind other than mine, which is active and creative, and is always sensing all of reality. But a creative, omnipresent, eternal, and omniscient mind is, by definition, God. So, God must exist. So Berkeley's thought is that this table is an idea in the mind of God, and that when I perceive this table, my mind is being affected by God's mind, with the idea of this table. Now, in the third dialogue, Berkeley considers and attempts to answer a series of objections to his immaterialism. First, Berkeley considers whether misperceptions are possible given immaterialism. It seems obvious to many, including Descartes, for example, that our senses are sometimes deceptive. Descartes referenced the cases of looking at things in the distance or of dreams. Now, it might seem that on Berkeley's immaterialism, misperceptions aren't possible. For if to be is to be perceived, how could a perception be an error? For example, if all there is to being red is looking red to a perceiver, then how could something be anything other than red while it's looking red to a perceiver? Or for another example, if all there is to being straight, or if all there is to being bent, is looking bent or looking straight to a perceiver, then it would seem that something can't be straight and yet look bent, since there's no more to being straight than looking straight. So Berkeley himself considers the case of a stick that looks straight to us out of the water and looks bent, half submerged in water. The objection is that there's no room on Berkeley's view to say that when the stick is half submerged in water, it looks bent, yet really is straight. Berkeley's response to this objection is to bite the bullet. Berkeley says that there is no error in our perceptions, and that error arises only when we draw inferences. Berkeley thinks that when we see a stick half submerged in water, looking bent, we're inclined to infer that when we withdraw the stick from the water, it'll still look bent. And Berkeley thinks that's an erroneous inference. And Berkeley thinks that after all, it's true of this particular stick that it looks straight out of the water and that it looks bent half submerged in water. And moreover, Berkeley thinks, to take Descartes' example, objects that look octagonal from a short distance away look circular from a farther distance away. So if the same object looks circular to us from a far distance and looks octagonal close up, there's no error in our perceptions. The only error is if we were to infer from the object looking circular from a far distance away that it would continue looking circular close up. The question that you should ask is whether this is satisfactory. Berkeley sees that there is no room on his view to identify a perception as being an error. Are you convinced by Berkeley's argument that the senses in fact never err, and that errors arise only when we draw inferences? The second sort of misperception that Berkeley discusses is dreams or hallucinations. For example, if I'm dreaming of vacationing on a tropical island, or if I'm walking through the desert and I'm hallucinating an oasis, are these perceptual states in error? Is there any sense in which I really am on a desert island? Or is there any sense in which there really is an oasis? It might seem as though Berkeley has to say yes, since all there is to the being of a thing is its being perceived. So it would seem that if I'm having a perceptual state that represents an oasis or a tropical island, then there must be an oasis or a tropical island. Berkeley's response to this objection is to say that dreams and hallucinations are faint and indistinct, and that they're wholly dependent on our will, unlike actual cases of sense perception. This response of Berkeley seems unconvincing to me, and I think it would seem unconvincing to Descartes as well. Descartes himself pointed out that our dreams are subjectively indistinguishable from our veridical perceptual states. It just seems inaccurate to describe our dreams as being somehow faint or indistinct in comparison to our veridical perceptual states. And the same goes for hallucination. It seems simply false to say that our hallucinations are dependent on our will. But on the other hand, it seems that Berkeley has another avenue for response here. It seems that in the case of dreams, as in the case of perceiving straight sticks out of water and bent sticks in water, Berkeley could say that our perceptual states are not themselves in error, and that error arises only when we draw inferences. So Berkeley could say that in the case of dreams, error arises only when I infer from being in the dreaming state of being on a tropical island, that when I awake, I'll be on a tropical island. So again, consider, if Berkeley can't say that our perceptual states themselves are in error, can he account for all errors by attributing these errors to our inferences? Now, the second sort of objection that Berkeley takes on concerns multiple sense organs, or multiple perceivers, perceiving the same thing. For an example, think of barbecue sauce. It looks red, and it tastes like smoke. But now, consider, is there room on Berkeley's view to say that the same thing looks red and tastes like smoke? It would seem not. For Berkeley, all there is to the being of a thing is its being perceived. So all there is to the red thing is its looking red. All there is to the thing that looks red is its looking red. So the same thing can look red and round to vision, but whatever looks red and round to vision has to be a different thing than the thing that tastes smoky to taste. And by the same token, whatever tastes smoky, the being of the thing is exhausted by its tasting smoky. In the case of barbecue sauce, it might taste sweet and smoky. In this case, it tastes sweet to taste, and it tastes smoky to taste. But there's no more to the being of the thing than its tasting sweet and smoky. In particular, the same thing, tastes sweet and smoky, can't be red. So it would seem to follow on Berkeley's view that what looks red and round to vision and what tastes sweet and smoky to taste, these are not the same thing. Now, again, Berkeley bites the bullet here. He admits that on his view, we do not, strictly speaking, taste, touch, smell, and see the same object. Instead, Berkeley suggests that objects are what he calls congeries of perceptions. In other words, any particular object is the collection of all of our perceptions of it. So the barbecue sauce is made up of my visual perception of it as being red, my gustatory perception of it as being sweet and smoky, and my olfactory perception of it as smelling like tomatoes. So in a sense then, even though it isn't strictly speaking the same thing that I taste and see and touch, my visual perception and my gustatory perception belong among the same collection of perceptions that make up the thing that I'm currently sensing. So the question to ask again is whether this is a satisfactory account of the being of things. A related concern is whether two people ever see the same thing. The thought here again is that the thing I'm currently seeing is exhausted by my current perceptions of it. There's no more to the being of a thing than its being perceived. So my current perception of this thing is all there is to the being of it. So since you and I can't have one and the same perceptions, you and I can't see one and the same things. Now, Berkeley's response here is to say that what we see can be qualitatively identical, even if what we see isn't numerically identical. So for two things to be qualitatively identical means that they share all the same qualities, or that they look alike. For things to be numerically identical is not just for them to look alike, but for them to be one and the same thing. Now Berkeley's claim is that you and I see the same thing only in the sense that we see two numerically different things that are qualitatively identical. We never see the same thing in the sense of numerical identity. Again, I'm not sure Berkeley has to take this avenue of response. If he's defined a thing as a congeries of perceptions, it would seem that the thing I see needn't just be a congeries of my perceptions, but could be a congeries of everyone's perceptions. In this sense then, although you and I wouldn't see exactly the same thing, just as my vision and my taste never sense exactly the same thing, you and I could have perceptions that belong to the same collection that make up a given thing, just like two of my sense organs have perceptions that belong to the same collection that makes up a given thing. This is not to say that Berkeley's response is successful, just that I think this is the strongest avenue of response Berkeley could take. The final objection that Berkeley considers is whether we can have an idea of God, or for that matter, whether we can have an idea of any minds. Remember, in Berkeley's critique of Locke's primary-secondary quality distinction, Berkeley argued that there can be no such thing as a primary quality as defined by Locke, since Locke defined primary qualities as resembling the ideas of them. And Berkeley argued against Locke that ideas can't resemble anything other than ideas. And remember, the intuitive force behind this objection was that only things of the same basic type can be like each other. The number 5 is like the number 7 in various ways, but there's no person that the number 5 is most like. So in just the same way, my idea of red or my idea of an apple can resemble an idea, but it can't resemble anything that is not an idea. Now, the objection for Berkeley is how I can have an idea of God. After all, God and my ideas are radically different in kind. In particular, God is active and creative and perfect, while my ideas are passively received and imperfect. So the thought is, if my idea of God is meant to represent God by somehow resembling God, I simply can't have an idea of God, because there can be no resemblance between my idea and God, which are two radically different kinds of things. Berkeley's response to this objection is to say that I form the idea of God by taking my idea of my own mind, removing my imperfections, and heightening my powers. But this raises the question, how can I have an idea even of my own mind? Aren't my mind and my ideas radically different kinds of things? In particular, my mind contains my ideas, and my ideas don't contain anything. My ideas are like images of things. My mind is not like an image of a thing. Berkeley's final response here is to say that I don't have an idea of my mind, strictly speaking, although I have a notion of it. I think this response gets right to the heart of the materialism-immaterialism, or realism-idealism debate. Remember, Berkeley's argument against realism was that it leads inevitably to skepticism. Thinking here was that if there's a material substance that underlies the sensible properties of things, and yet all our ideas of things come through our senses, then all we can have knowledge of are the sensible properties of things, and not the material substance that underlies them. This would seem to be a skeptical view, since we have no knowledge, not even any ideas, of the fundamental nature of reality. But now, on Berkeley's view, it would seem that reality consists in ideas that are perceived by the mind of God, and yet we do not, strictly speaking, have any idea of the mind of God. So it would seem that Berkeley's immaterialism leads just as inevitably to skepticism as materialism does. It would seem that if it's open to Berkeley to say that we have a notion of mind or a notion of God's mind, then by the same token, it should be open to the materialist to say that, although strictly speaking, we don't have an idea of material substance, we have a notion of it. So now, in your papers, I want you to enter into the realism-idealism debate. Consider how compelling is Berkeley's argument against materialism? How compelling is this argument for immaterialism? And how satisfactory are Berkeley's attempts to defend immaterialism against the objections he considers in the third dialogue? In your papers, you should try to identify what it is that you think is most compelling about Berkeley's immaterialism, and also what is least compelling about Berkeley's immaterialism, and most compelling about realism.